Welcome to the IR Digital Podcast. IR Global is the largest international professional services network, and I'm your host of the IR Digital Podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today, we're sitting down with Laura Thalacker, a Las Vegas management side labor attorney and employment attorney. And we're talking about whether employers may require or even encourage their employees to get vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus, and what type of legal issues that creates under both federal law and state law. There are so many topics around this, and also we know the circumstances are changing all the time, so I'm going to timestamp this as that we are recording this on the morning of Wednesday, April 7th, 2021, and a lot of what we're going to be providing is evergreen, but of course the actual legal situation and specifically how many vaccines are rolled out, what information about these different vaccines, what vaccines are approved will certainly change, possibly by the time you're listening, but eventually. So keep that in mind. But the evergreen advice we are offering employers, we hope will help you for the long run about this controversial topic. So hi, Laura, how are you doing today? Why don't you start by giving us a bit about yourself and how you made it into a niche that I didn't think I knew existed a year ago.
Well, hi, Jen. Thanks for having me on today. I have been practicing in Nevada for around 27 years now as a labor and employment lawyer, specifically on the management side. That means that I work with large and small companies that usually have a pretty specific Nevada connection. But I do have clients who are worldwide. I have clients throughout the US because, as we know, business these days is not typically isolated within a state's borders or even within the US borders. And so I find myself lucky enough through IR Global me to collaborate a lot of times with other lawyers in the group. And I always think of all places to practice labor and employment law, Nevada is probably one of the most interesting places to do that. We always have the best fact patterns in Las Vegas, I say. And it's been a great place to practice, and I love my clients, and I really feel like it's a job where you can help people. I really focus on compliance with my clients and avoiding litigation and trying to do things right up front so that employees are treated well, that businesses can thrive, and then it's an overall good situation for everybody who's associated with that business. In addition to my legal degree, I do want to just mention that I do have HR certifications that are senior certifications through the Society for Human Resources Management and the HR Certification Institute. And I think what that adds to my practice is I have sort of a business focus and a practical side of HR advice that sometimes is a real supplement to the legal side of things. So that's just a basic overview of my practice.
For sure, because obviously litigation is the last step of your job, and you want to advise teams on how to best deal with the humans in their employment.
Absolutely.
So totally
and I mean, and my firm does do litigation, and that's just an inevitable part of the US society where there are a lot of lawsuits, I think, as people know. And then the other thing is my firm, we also have a commercial litigation practice as well. So I primarily focus on the labor and employment management side, whether it's the advice and compliance and the litigation stuff. And then my business partner, Doreen Hartwell, focuses on commercial litigation.
Okay, yeah, it's totally important, and the combination of the two totally makes sense for those listening and gets to part of what we're talking about today, not just can you, could you, but should you implore colleagues to do certain things. So it completely is very interesting. I guess to give a bit of backdrop to the work you do, what type of industries or businesses do you work with, to give a visualization, for people who aren't as familiar with the state, I think when we hear Nevada, we hear Las Vegas, we hear Reno, we hear casinos. So I'm sure that's part of it. I'm sure hospitality is part of it, but all of these things we do not necessarily associate with 2020 or even early 2021. So What's it like on the ground there? What's
Yeah,
business
well, so
like?
there are really, of course, in Nevada, hospitality is the main industry, right? I mean, everybody wants to go to Las Vegas or Reno or anywhere else in the state where we have these great casinos and hotels. And that is the dominant industry, unquestionably. And I have clients who are in the gaming industry, hotels, casinos, businesses that support the hotels, casinos, and are certain vendors on site and so forth. But then there's also other sides of Nevada that people don't necessarily think about. For example, I represent mining companies, and there are many mining companies in Nevada. There are tech companies in Nevada that we work with. There are all kinds of mom and pop businesses, right? And legal, professional, and we represent in manufacturing. We represent employers in pretty much every sector. It's mostly private industry, I would say, though. We do very little government, public employer work, although here and there we do some of that. And then the other thing is my clients tend to be non-union shops, although there are times that we do some work for employers who have unionized workforces.
And a lot of what you just said, I assume mining still is happening, though very difficult to socially distance. All of these jobs a lot of the jobs you mentioned are highly social jobs involving outside people as well. When we talk about casino, hospitality, restaurant industry, which is the state in trouble? Is the economy in trouble? Does it need these vaccines to get boosted and get going again?
Absolutely. I think everyone in Nevada recognizes that things are not going to get back to normal. And this is true everywhere in the world until we have gotten vaccinated and moved past COVID. At one point early on in Southern Nevada, 1/3 of our workforce was out of work. Wow. With the COVID pandemic, 1/3. We're now hovering at around 8 or 9%. In Southern Nevada, the statewide numbers are lower. So we have come a long way from where we were last March and April when 1/3 of the workers in Las Vegas were out of work. And that's really good to see. But we all know that to really get past this, we are going to have to get as many shots in arms as possible and as quickly as possible. And it's a race right now between the variants as well. Those are starting to spread more rapidly. And so the US has really accelerated its vaccination pace, especially in the last month. We've had one day recently where there were over 4 million shots given in one day. And now the average is around 3 million. And so we are seeing some serious progress, but there's obviously still a long way to go. And one of the things that's going to be really interesting, because in Nevada, as of April 5th, everybody 16 and older is eligible for shots. So the question is, will the supply be there? And they're working on that, and it may take a while, but if you're 16 and over and want a shot, you will be able to get one relatively soon. We're moving into a period, though, where we're going to get to the point where people have all gotten the shot who want it. And then what happens when we're still not at the herd immunity point? And that's where this discussion that we're having today, I think, gets really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely heard on National Public Radio today that about 1/3 of Americans are not sure, or more likely are not wanting to get a shot. So it is a large percentage. We don't know where that falls across the United States, and there's still the idea that under 16, it doesn't look like we'll be getting vaccines soon. So herd immunity seems very challenging right now. So we're dealing with so many changing things, but there is that proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. First, just to lay table stakes, is it free for everyone?
Yes.
Can anyone?
Yes, it is. So if you have insurance, most places will ask you for your insurance card and you give it to them. And then there's the procedure for health insurance reimbursement. But anybody else, regardless of whether you have insurance or not, it is free. And that is one of the things that employers should make sure to communicate to employees, because perhaps somebody's worried about the cost. And if we're very affirmative that it is free and make it as simple as possible for people to go get it, hopefully that will also increase vaccination rates.
When you say make it as simple as possible, I know one of the problems in the US, especially for marginalized people getting the vaccine, is that they're very 9 to 5 hours of giving vaccines. Is there an effort in your state, or you're seeing, to either give people time off work to get the vaccine, or to deal with, often there are side effects, which are much better, we can say, than actually getting the coronavirus, but there are side effects at times that run people down for a day or two, or at least getting time off to go to those, or to offer vaccinations at different hours? Are there initiatives like that?
Yes. I mean, there are efforts. We're in a 24-hour-a-day environment in Las Vegas. So I think that it is possible to get a shot pretty much at any time of the day or night, with some limitations, obviously, for scheduling. But I think that, most employers are realizing that if employees need time off to go get the vaccine, they are fine with that. Of course, sometimes you want to schedule shifts. If you're a small employer, you may not want everybody to go out and do it at once, because you don't know if people are going to have side effects, and you want to be able to staff your workplace. But at the same time, you want people to get vaccinated as quickly as possible. So the CDC has said, be careful with this issue of staggering. Don't stagger so much that you take too long to get your people vaccinated. So there's kind of a balancing act that goes with that. And the Nevada Labor Commissioner has said that employees should be able to use PTO, vacation, sick leave to go get vaccinated. Some employers, though, are not requiring employees to use accrued vacation, sick leave, or PTO, and they're actually being more affirmative and saying, hey, we'll give you 4 hours off paid, or we'll give you the day off, or you can have the day you go get vaccinated and the next day off paid so that you can recover. And that is really not mandated. Those are things that employers are voluntarily doing at this point. One thing that's interesting, especially with the gaming industry, is the Nevada Gaming Control Board is affirmatively encouraging gaming operators to adopt measures that will materially increase access to the vaccine for its employees. And this recent memo that was just issued within the past few days actually ties floor occupancy levels on the gaming floor to efforts by the gamers to get their people vaccinated. So currently Nevada is at 50% gaming floor occupancy, and May 1st it goes to local control, but the Gaming Control Board and the Gaming Commission have control over gaming in Nevada. They have said that to get above that 50% level before it will be authorized, the gaming companies will have to show that they've taken real efforts to get their workers vaccinated. And we can talk about what that means and the types of efforts that we're seeing.
That's super interesting, because I think it's more the carrot than the stick. It's not,
absolutely,
you're going to get fired if you don't get vaccinated. It's what you're talking about is a lot of positive initiatives, like offering days off or time off or paid time to actually go get vaccinated during your working hours. So that's really positive. And then from the gaming initiative, ways that would obviously motivate casinos to want to have their floors more full, and to obviously want their staff to be safe, because you want your staff to be happy and safe, and you don't want to have to shut down because you have an outbreak. So it totally makes sense. That's actually
well, and
really
currently that memo does not say casinos, you must mandate that your frontline workers get vaccinated. It doesn't say that. It goes through the list of things that employers can do to encourage vaccination. And, it needs to be material and measurable steps to increase vaccination. But they did fall short of saying, casinos, you have to mandate it, which I think there would have been real pushback if casinos were instructed that they had to require vaccinations, because as I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit, there's a lot of issues with mandating vaccinations that can create legal problems for employers. And so generally in the US, even though you theoretically could mandate, very, very few employers seem to be going that route at this point.
Fascinating. Yeah, because I definitely wanted to ask you if employers can force their employees to get vaccinated. So let's talk about more about that, and what is the status of that? Why would certain employers want to go that route, or why would most of them like to avoid that?
And I'm going to take issue just with one little piece of your language there with forcing vaccination. There would be no situation where an employer or the government in the US could physically hold somebody down and force them to take the vaccine. And I don't think that that's what you're saying, but it is worth, I think it's worth noting, because unfortunately there are histories at times where people have been required to do things against their will, but that's certainly not the case at this point with vaccinations, and certainly not at a government level. So instead of forcing, I think I probably like the terminology mandating a little better, or requiring.
Yeah.
So not to be too picky, but
no, it's fair. It's also how you get toddlers to get vaccinated. So sometimes this happens, but that's up to the
parent, right?
Yeah.
But we're generally talking about adults here. So
yeah,
we will say, can employers mandate the vaccine? And the EEOC in the US, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the CDC have said that provided it's permitted under state law, that employers could mandate vaccinations, but with exceptions based on health status, disability, and religion. And so then you get into the US, which has a patchwork of state and federal laws. So in Nevada, there is no state law prohibiting employers from mandating vaccinations. Now, it's interesting, in response to COVID, laws like that are being proposed all over the United States, saying employers, you're not allowed to mandate it. There's a question about whether those will actually be adopted. I'm not aware of any in Nevada that have been proposed. And then on the flip side of that, there are some states there have been some proposals in states where they say, we're going to pass a law that says employers can mandate vaccines. So it goes both ways. I think the legislation that's been introduced has generally been the prohibitive route, but every state is different. So in Nevada currently, I don't think that law is on the books. It's not on the books. I know it's not. I'm not aware of it currently being proposed at this point. But certainly if you're looking at this issue, you're in Nevada or you're in some other state or jurisdiction, you would want to check that local law to see if there are any prohibitions on mandating vaccinations.
And I wonder if employees have that ability, or even employers, I guess that's why they hire you, but to know their legal rights. It's not exactly the easiest thing to do. Google, well, maybe you can Google, can they make me? But that might lead to a lot of fake news results.
Oh, and it's dangerous because, we're right next door to California, and a lot of California and Nevada labor laws are drastically different. And I cannot tell you the number of times that I've worked with Nevada lawyers who are not in compliance with Nevada law because they have done something that's allowed in California, but not in Nevada. And their policies might be Nevada or California policies that they're trying to use in Nevada. And they're not the same. And so you do have to be really, really careful. And there are some great resources out there. Nevada has tried to be a really business-friendly state. And on the Nevada Secretary of State's websites, and most states would have similar initiatives, but the Nevada Secretary of State's website, the Nevada Labor Commissioner's website, the Nevada Equal Rights Commission's website, all of them have guides for employers that you can pull up, but you just never know if they're very current. And it's always good to get outside legal advice generally if you're trying to be compliant up front.
Absolutely. So when we talk about these requirements of employers to get their employees vaccinated, or with, of course, allowances for reasonable things like if someone has an allergy to vaccinations, or have some immune issue that they cannot, or other healthcare guidance. How does this work? Especially, it's kind of a weird situation because I was very excited to get my vaccine last summer as part of the trial. But it is still an emergency use authorization. It's not mainstream like an MMR vaccine or something, or even, I don't even know if chickenpox is yet in the US, or maybe the flu jab. But when we're talking about this is still an experimental vaccine. Are there moral or legal issues surrounding that?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions that has been raised and has contributed to some of the uncertainty about to what extent employers could or should be mandating vaccines. Generally, the FDA, the CDC in the US will tell you these vaccines have undergone extensive testing, and the medical professionals will tell you that they are safe and that they have been vetted thoroughly. But you're right, it is under an emergency use authorization. And there is some language in laws governing the CDC that has raised some questions and given a little bit of leeway for people to argue that employers should not mandate vaccines based on the emergency use status. To my knowledge, there has only been one case filed on that. Early in March, somebody sued. It was a public employment situation in New Mexico, where the person was challenging the employer's vaccine mandate on the basis that it violated the provisions of the FDA emergency use authorization. That case is still in federal court, to my understanding, in New Mexico. It has not wound its way through the litigation process. Generally, the legal consensus is at this point, and based on EEOC and CDC guidance, that employers could mandate it despite the emergency use authorization nature. Certainly, that's the way people think it will play out in courts, but until there's a specific decision on that, you really don't know, and there is some risk. And, employers, as a practical matter, may get much further in getting their employees vaccinated if you do use the carrot instead of the stick. So even if you can mandate it, it seems to be the consensus is that unless you are in a really particular industry like healthcare, where you're right on the front lines and are dealing with people who are immunocompromised or other major health conditions, it really does seem like most employers are falling along the lines of, we are going to encourage it, but not mandate it.
How do you even prove that you're vaccinated? Isn't that like your private medical history?
Yeah, so the EEOC has said, and the CDC, that employers can require proof of vaccination. If they want to ask employees if they have been vaccinated, they can ask them for proof of it. What you can't do is say, give me all your medical records. I want to check and see if the vaccinations are in there. But if you wanted to require an employee to show you their vaccination card or copy it for you, or I had one client recently who was having employees forward the email to them that just said you're scheduled, and they took that as proof. But once employers get that information, they need to keep it in a separate medical file, because the fact that you were vaccinated it is medical information. Under these pandemic circumstances, it's allowable to ask, because employers have to be able to make decisions about if somebody is not vaccinated, do they need to think about other options where they would maybe move them, allow them to work remotely? Would they maybe move them to the back of the house instead of the front of the house? But you can't really make those decisions unless you know who's vaccinated and who's not. So you can ask, but you have to be really limited. You can't go beyond the "are you vaccinated?" So if somebody says, "No, I'm not vaccinated," you should not say to them, "Why not? Why didn't you get your vaccination?" Because then you could get into the medical and health issues with the person, where they may say, "Well, I'm not getting vaccinated because I had an anaphylactic reaction." And I mean, you could start getting information that would be a medical inquiry under the Americans with Disabilities Act and could create problems for you. So you really have to keep that inquiry limited to, "Are you vaccinated?" and give me the proof if you say you are, and then we'll keep it in a separate medical file. And we haven't really talked about the issues with the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and most state laws do have their own state versions. You know, Nevada certainly has its own disability laws that really pretty much mirror the federal laws. But that is the biggest exception probably in terms of what employers will need to deal with, even mandating or encouraging, and maybe with incentives that they're providing and so forth. They will almost certainly encounter some employees who, for a medical reason, cannot have the vaccine, and they need to know what to do with that. And then, of course, there are also exemptions for sincerely held religious beliefs. And employers who encounter employees who raise exceptions or exemptions based on religion or medical issues really should be careful and talk with counsel about that.
I was going to say, because immediately I flag so many issues that a lot of people don't want to disclose perhaps their religious belief, perhaps their disability, because it could put them more at risk later. And while the CDC says, sure, pregnant women can and should get the vaccine, a pregnant woman may not want to because it is still emergency use authorization. Mm-hmm. But maybe she doesn't want to disclose that she's pregnant yet. And these are all this feels like a quagmire of potentially infringing on someone's personal right to privacy or personal right to not explain or express their disability, because it could risk their employment or their ability to move up within an organization. So how does that even work? How do you deal with attacks because of religion or racism and bigotry, that people could be genuinely attacked because of their faith? So how do they deal with that? How should an employer address that? But also, if you're offering these benefits of time off to people that cannot get vaccinated, is that biased as well?
Yes, as you've said, you have to be super careful, and it's filled with issues. And at the point where an employee is requesting some sort of accommodation where they do not want to get vaccinated when the employer is encouraging it, or if it's being mandated, and they raise an exemption, then the law says there are certain steps that you take for establishing the exemption. So in the US, if somebody is requesting an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the employer, and there's federal laws and regulations governing this. So, and it's easy for employers to get in trouble. And so some of your fears about discrimination and so forth, yes, unfortunately, those things happen and they're real, but there's also remedies for those things. But hopefully, again, employers that I deal with will know that when you have a request for an accommodation under the ADA, you need to engage in an interactive process with the employee where you try to come up with a reasonable accommodation. The employer is also allowed, with limits, when there's an accommodation request for medical reasons, to request certain documentation. They're not entitled to get the person's entire medical history, but they are entitled to get information that shows the person's need for the accommodation and what the issues are so that you can engage in this interactive process. Now, the process for getting a religious exemption is a little bit different, unlike the ADA or the disability laws, where you can request information from the doctor as kind of a routine part of this interactive process. For religious exemptions, unless the employer has sort of an objective basis for questioning whether the person is sincere in saying that they have this religious exemption, and there could be any number of facts that lead the employer to question the sincerity. And there's some case law with some interesting stuff where that's been questioned. Generally you accept people when they say that they have this sincerely held religious belief, unless you have a reason to question it. And you try to accommodate it. Now, under both laws, there is a concept of undue hardship, where the employer may not have to allow an accommodation request if it's an undue hardship, and the tests are different under the disability laws and the religious laws as to what constitutes an undue hardship, which again, all gets very complicated. And unless you are a highly seasoned HR person, or you are yourself a labor and employment lawyer, you probably need to talk to a labor and employment lawyer on those accommodations questions.
It sounds like that's a safer way to go. Now, on the flip side, does someone have the right to work with vaccinated people? Like, does someone, especially if someone has a lower immune system or is in the many plethora of groups that would be at higher risk to catch COVID, even if they're vaccinated or they cannot be, do they have the right to know if their colleague is vaccinated or not, especially as we move in the next couple months? Social distancing and masks will begin to disappear, I think.
That is a super interesting question. And just to note, in Nevada, they have been clear that even when workforces have been vaccinated or people are being vaccinated, at this point, all of the public health advice still applies. Still social distancing, still masks, still washing hands regularly. All of the public health measures are staying in place. We're not even close to that yet with the vaccinations, where we would stop any of those measures. That's a really interesting question, though, about whether a person has a right to work only with vaccinated people. Probably not. There's obviously, if a person has a health condition that puts them at greater risk and they need to be, and it's unsafe for them to be at work because of that condition and because of COVID, the employer, again, would talk with them and try to work out an accommodation under disability laws and go through the interactive process with that employee who is concerned about whether their coworkers are vaccinated. The employer cannot, from a privacy perspective, they would not be able to specifically name this person's vaccinated, this person isn't, this person isn't. They would generally, I think, have to keep that information private, but it would be really hard. Like, let's say an employee tried to bring an OSHA complaint, that's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and says, I don't feel safe at work. My employer's not mandating the vaccine. They're not giving me a safe workplace. That would be a very difficult claim to make. The employer would show all of the other health and safety measures they're taking. And unless there's a regulation or a law that's mandating vaccinations and the employer's not following it, that would really, in my view, be about the only way that an OSHA complaint like that would succeed. So as of now, workers generally do not have the right to say, I will only work with people who are vaccinated.
Super interesting case if it comes up, though. I'll keep an eye out for that. So in general, it's clear that besides the gym in New Jersey that is providing free memberships for people to not get vaccinated, the vast majority of organizations understand that the quicker they get vaccinated, the quicker they can open up, get more business. It's good for the economy and stuff. So what is the best way? What are you recommending to employers about policies on worker vaccinations? And what have you been seeing working or maybe not working so far?
Well, and there are a number of different steps that employers can take. I will say that I have a real range of clients on this. Some are super proactive and interested in promoting, incentivizing. I have other employers who are uncomfortable with that. Some of it's this emergency use authorization issue that you raised before. So not all employers are pushing hard. I think most of them are communicating. There's discussions about it, but there is a range. I just want to be clear on that, that not everybody is gung-ho and adopting just massive programs to do this. So I'll talk about Nevada a little bit, and then I'll give some general comments. One thing to note now in Nevada, partially even before this gaming control memo came out, many of the major casinos have now established on-site clinics where their workers can get vaccinated. And those are often run by a third-party provider who comes on site and administers the vaccinations. But some of them are health clinics on site associated with the gaming companies. And so, for example, the Wynn Hotel has been vaccinating people for a couple months on site through a third-party provider. The MGM, Caesars, Cosmopolitan, Station Casinos, we are finally at the point where there is enough vaccine that, and because of the hospitality industry in Nevada and trying to get our economy moving again, we are at the point where employers finally, big employers, if they want to, and this is part of the encouragement question, how are you encouraging people to do it? Some employers, large employers who have the space, who have the resources, are doing on-site vaccination clinics. And that's becoming more common. There are guidelines that have been issued by the CDC to help employers who want to establish on-site clinics. A lot of my clients are small and medium-sized companies who would just never undertake that type of operation, but you can certainly understand in Nevada with the gaming companies why they have a real interest in doing that. And now, especially if they want to get their occupancy over 50%, they want to make it as easy as possible for their workers and sometimes the workers' families to get in there and get vaccinated. So that's kind of the one extreme where, how do you encourage it? We're going to set up a site right at our business, right? So that's about as easy as can be. And if employers do that, the CDC has said that it should be during working time, it should be offered. And if people are doing it during working time, then they would actually be getting paid while they're getting the vaccine. So
that's good because it is a process. Yeah, it's not the 10-minute process that you go to get a jab from the pharmacy for the flu. There are questions to be asked. There is a process, temperature.
Right. It may take a little while to get it, and they don't want employers docking employees' pay while they're going to get the vaccine. And any medical information or health information that's collected on site typically would be retained by the third-party provider. If for some reason the employer is directly operating the clinic, then the employer would segregate all medical information, keep it in a separate file, guard its security and so forth. So then, I mean, there are several other things. We've already talked a little bit about the paid time off as an incentive. I've heard several employers doing 4 hours. Some are doing 6 hours. I've heard other people who say that's just too much of a hassle. We're just going to give them the whole day off and not deal with the scheduling and the potential complications. So that's one thing. Arranging transportation for employees to sites. Maybe you will pay for their Uber or their Lyft if transportation is an issue. That's one measure that employers have been encouraged to take. Other things to be creative for small companies, you might want to reach out to a specific pharmacy or the health district to see if they will do something in particular with your business. Will they come to you with a mobile truck? Will they allow your workers to come in at a certain time of the day at a specific pharmacy. Those are things that companies that don't have a lot of resources might be able to arrange and explore. And then of course there's monetary incentives. Some companies are giving people, $50 for their first shot, another $50 for their second shot. There are some companies who are giving more than that, but or free dinners, or an extra vacation day down the road, or the promise of a huge party once COVID is over if everybody's vaccinated. You can be creative with them, but the issue is with the incentives. If it becomes more than de minimis, you could have issues under ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act regulations related to wellness programs, which have to be voluntary. And there's discussions about regulations, and this issue of the incentives and how much you can provide is a real question. There's also potential under wage and hour laws and this gets super complicated. It's very specific to the US, federal and state law, whether an incentive is so large that it then becomes compensation that has to be factored into the wage rate for overtime purposes. I could sit here and come up with question after question related to the incentives. What do you do if a person who has a disability objection or religious exemption doesn't qualify for these great incentives that you're giving? Is it discriminatory if you don't create some alternative route for them to earn the same incentive? Those are just a few of the issues, and they're real. These are being actively debated and discussed, not only just theoretically among lawyers, but by HR people on the ground who are having to implement and decide which programs they're going to put in place.
Yeah, I was going to ask, who is actually leading this discussion in organizations? Is it human resources? Is it legal? Is it just managers? If it's a smaller place, who should be involved in this? And should these be more ad hoc, or do these have to be written down?
Companies need to have a plan that is understood and developed and supported at the highest levels all the way through the organization into frontline managers. And you want, with this particular issue, with vaccinations, which can very, very quickly, especially in the US, become extremely political. You want to make it about business. You want to take business and science. You want to take the politics out of it. And so an organization does have to have a coherent and cohesive plan and approach on this. And so that usually involves executives. It usually involves HR people if they have HR people. It usually involves legal if there's an in-house lawyer or they're consulting with their outside counsel. And then you bring in the managers and you talk about messaging. But communication is really, really critical. And that's also been recognized by the CDC, and also for the Nevada Gaming Commission, for example, and the Gaming Control Board. They want you to be affirmatively communicating with employees honestly and candidly about the benefits of the vaccine. It's advisable for employers to listen to their employees. Don't just sweep employee concerns under the rug. People have valid questions and concerns about whether to take this vaccine. And perhaps the best way to overcome vaccine hesitancy is through trusted people in their lives to give them candid information. Don't just say, oh, don't worry about it, nothing's going to happen. Give them statistics. Tell them, yes, there have been some side effects. Generally, they're mild. Here's the percentage of people who've had severe reactions, and there's medics on site, and here's how we deal with it. And just if you can make it about science and trusted information, not from trusted information from reliable sources, that may and has been shown at times to be effective in overcoming vaccine hesitancy. So that's got to be part of the whole big picture, is the communication piece. I just read an article about Amazon, for example, and this has been encouraged by the CDC, and not just Amazon, but other employers, posting posters throughout their facilities talking about the vaccine, its safety, its efficacy, how to get it. And they were saying that, in the bathroom stalls at Amazon, there are posters talking about vaccinations. And every employer, based on their culture, is going to have a different approach. But they do think, and this is kind of where we started too, we are at this really interesting point where there's going to be enough vaccine for everybody in the US very soon. We're going to see what levels we get to for vaccination. We probably won't, in this initial wave, be at herd immunity. And so how do you work with people so that they feel comfortable and we get enough people to get our levels up where we can take it voluntarily? And that's going to be, and employers play a really important part of that. Spiritual advisors play an important part of that. People who are, anybody, a family member who's trusted. But what we know is that politicians are usually not the best messengers for that, at least in the US. People are going to trust people they know and love and have a relationship with. But if it becomes political here, that's not a good starting point for us.
Absolutely. Definitely what you said about creating trusted conversations with trusted people is really valuable, and we need more of that, especially in the workplace and with employers. But as we're looking to the next steps and allowing people to go places and do things, so not just the employers and the employees, but also the guests, are there such things as vaccine passports? Are they the way out of this? Are they even something being legally discussed right now or able to be required from venues?
So vaccine, and you call them passports. I'll explain to you, I would prefer the term certifications as opposed to passports, but they are actively being discussed. And this is a really hot topic right now throughout the US and in Nevada, particularly, where we have so many tourists and we want people to come to Nevada, and we want people to know that it's safe and it can be the fun place and great place that it's always been. But there are some people who are hesitant to go without knowing that there are safety precautions in place. And so as part of that, one of the conversations is about vaccine certificates, although they are commonly referred to as passports. And the reason I don't like the passport language is because passports are something that are issued by governments generally and are mandated. You love lawyers, that's where my mind goes. So I think in the US, where it has been really clear, and I know it's different in some countries, but in the US, the Biden administration has been really clear that the federal government is not going to be in the business of issuing vaccine passports. What they have said is they encourage private companies to explore the idea of certifications that may be used to reopen businesses and prove that certain segments of the population are vaccinated. But also the federal government has a role in making sure that if private companies are collecting this data and using this data for goods and services, that the data is protected, because we have big privacy concerns, obviously, and also that there's an equitable, non-discriminatory way that these certifications, vaccine certifications, could be used. So what does that mean for a state like Nevada? There are some venues, convention centers. There's a couple of private companies in Nevada that are currently working on vaccine certificates. There are some convention centers. I believe the Las Vegas Sands announced that they would use some sort of vaccine certification program, but then they are calling it passports. But they haven't said if it's going to be mandatory for everybody. The idea is too that it would be used with testing as well. So it might be an app on a phone. And again, I'm not talking about the Las Vegas Sands in particular here. I'm talking generally now about the way they would potentially work in the US. It would be like a boarding pass on your phone. Maybe it shows that it doesn't show that you're vaccinated, but it shows that right before you wanted to go to this concert, you had a negative COVID test within a certain period of time. So you would be allowed to enter, even though you haven't been vaccinated, you've had a negative test. That's one example where they really don't work without a testing and the testing component versus just the certification component, because certification component would be hard with, there are people, as we've been talking about, they have religious exceptions and they have disability concerns related to getting vaccinated. So it would be discriminatory if places absolutely say you can't come in here because you couldn't take the vaccine. So you have to, it's going to be a really hard discussion. The discussions are underway. Generally, if you're a private business, you have the right to exclude people from your place of business. But at the same time, when you do have issues related to disability or religion that might keep somebody from getting vaccinated, all those things have to be factored in. So at some point you may see, and again, plans are underway for some version of an electronic record showing your vaccination and also coupled potentially with negative tests.
Which gets back to, do people have the right to socialize or be around or work with people who are vaccinated or who have negative tests? It's definitely happening, at least where I'm based in the UK. Rapid testing is just across the board in some sectors, whether education or medicine, because there's the idea that people have to, if we're bringing people back and we are trying to get back to so-called normal, people need to have that feeling of security and safety. And certainly that's the only way the cruise industry is going to bounce back from this, if at all.
They may have cruises that are only for people who have been vaccinated. So at some point, there may be flights only for people who have been vaccinated. I can't, obviously, and I know you can't either, predict what direction that's going to go. There in US society, there's going to be a lot of pushback about that if people are excluded for not being vaccinated. And I think the better route is to go through all these measures we just talked about, not just at the employment level, but societally, and try to come to some agreement about, vaccinations are not just about yourself, they're about the community, right? And so I do think that in the US, I'm hopeful we're going to get to a place where we can all agree that we have to get past COVID. And what are the steps to take to get past COVID? It's the public health measures plus the vaccination. And until then, we just have a lot of work to do to try to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully maybe by 2022, I'll see you, Laura, at an IR Global in-person event again after 2 years on hiatus.
That would be amazing. Yeah, no, it's been great.
Just to mention again to those listening, of course, by the time you've listened to this, even in the processing and editing as rapid as possible, things may have changed. But the guidance and the intention and the intent behind this conversation stays the same, that we want to make people feel comfortable. We want to get back to business, and we want to do it in the healthiest and safest way that is legal and protective of employees' rights. So thank you so much. I've certainly learned a lot about both US federal and state laws regarding vaccination. And thank you to our listeners. These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers like Laura, accountants, and financial advisors with extensive knowledge on topics you as professionals need to know about. And it would be fair you wouldn't, especially when we're talking about vaccines. So thank you for the listeners. And to learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it. So Laura, if our listeners want to touch base with you to learn more about you, your law practice, or I'm pretty sure there's going to be more questions about the topic discussed today, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
So you can reach me on LinkedIn. The IR also has a member portal where if you look up Nevada and labor and employment, you'll find my contact information, or you can email me at laura@hartwellthalacker.com, and we would love to hear from you. And we know this is a complicated issue. We know things are changing all the time with it. So we are very open to questions and I'm looking forward to helping people with this.
Laura is happy to support you, and we're happy that you're supporting your teams. So thank you everyone for listening, and have a great day.